Hi, this is Jana London from the Natural Women's Council. I'm standing outside today in Dublin, Ireland, at the headquarters of BeLongTo, Ireland's LGBTQI youth organisation. We're just about to meet with a BeLongTo whistleblower who's going to share his first-hand experience of attending BeLongTo meetings as a gay adolescent. Let's hear what he has to say. Hi, Sean. Good morning. Thank you so much for coming forward as a whistleblower today to share your first-hand experience that you had with BeLongTo, which is Ireland's LGBTQ youth organisation. If you can take a moment to introduce yourself.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks very much for having me. My name's Sean Atkinson and I'm the Vice President and Co-Founder of the group Not All Gays. Outside of that, I like to write in my free time and I'm a clerical officer for the government.
Great. And when did you attend the BeLongTo youth meetings and how old were you?
I attended BeLongTo when I was 16 years old, back in 2016 and 2017.
And why did you decide to avail of BeLongTo's youth service? Why did you attend and how did you hear about the service?
I heard about BeLongTo off some gay friends and other people that I knew that were going, and I wanted to go to meet other young gay people and try form some sort of a community.
Okay. And can you tell me about the meetings that you attended?
Yeah, no problem. So I mostly attended the Sunday group, which was aged between 14 and 24 years old, of the people attending. And it would start off with people introduce themselves. You'd go around the room with your name, your pronouns, and some fact about yourself. And then we'd be led into a youth-led discussion, oftentimes done by what's known as a peer educator. So that would be anyone could sign up to learn how to, use Google Slides or whatever, and they'd have the freedom to do presentations and talk about whatever they wanted.
Okay. You mentioned that people would introduce themselves using pronouns. So in the case where someone didn't have pronouns or decided not to address someone by pronouns, perhaps they were gender critical, how was that received by BeLongTo?
That would never have been received well. If it goes against anyone who disagrees with anything got to do with gender ideology, would have been outcast by the group. You'd often have a lot of young people getting really angry and offended towards anyone who would have questioned the ideology.
So if you had a diverse dissenting view to the pronouns, you said you were outcasted, and what might be things that were done to make you feel outcasted or excluded?
There'd be a lot of people giving out to you at the same time. The youth workers wouldn't step in. They'd only really step in if you were coming from the opposite angle of, like, if I were to ask someone a question about their pronouns, I'd be the one being told not to speak. But if other people were trying to correct me, oftentimes in a very aggressive manner, with plenty of people in the room doing it, then it was more than acceptable.
Okay. You had mentioned at the meetings that there were presentations. Who gave the presentations and what would be examples of some of the content of the presentations?
Yeah, so the presentations were led mostly by the young people. If there was anything like that went wrong, like say a homophobic attack or an event coming up, then the youth workers would do a presentation on that. But anything else would be very ideological based. So you'd have a young person talking about different types of surgeries they could get, different pathways into transition, or the LGBT history like that they made up about, the lies with Marsha P. Johnson and so on.
And what were the lies that they were telling about the founder was it BeLongTo, or the founder of the gay rights?
Of the gay rights movement.
Yeah.
So basically there's this narrative that we all owed all of our, the gays owed all of our rights to a black trans woman in America called Marsha P. Johnson, when in fact this was actually a drag queen who was involved in taking in underage boys who were, disowned by their parents and putting them into prostitution, kind of like pimping them off, and he had no involvement whatsoever with the gay rights movement. But this narrative was kind of to make us feel like we owed something to trans ideology.
Right. And did anyone question this lie that was told, and question who the founder was, and what was the response from the BeLongTo youth workers if it was questioned?
No, that was never questioned. We kind of just all took it as fact because no one really stepped in to correct the narrative. And so many people in the room would be like, oh, I heard about that, and they'd back it up. So it was we were never really spoken critically about it.
Okay.
how were young people attending the BeLongTo youth service made to feel when they came out, whether it was coming out as gay or coming out as trans? How were they made to feel when they first started attending?
Yeah, so when you go and like you announce yourself as gay or bisexual, everyone's delighted. And then if you go and start using pronouns, such as like if you're non-binary and you go by they, them, then everyone's delighted for you. But the further you go down, the more applause you get and the more glorification.
Okay. And was there any sort of discussions where people were made to, rather than accept that they were gay or going down the path, that they were made to feel like a victim? We hear a lot about homophobia and transphobia. Was there any sort of kind of oppressive victimhood discussions in the groups?
Yeah, absolutely. We were definitely all made to feel like we were oppressed, that there was this enemy we had to fight, whether we were gay, bi, trans. They kind of feed this narrative that our rights are always under attack. We have to constantly defend them. The homophobia is everywhere. And of course, homophobia exists, but they really wanted us to kind of feel fear in our lives.
So as a gay adolescent attending the BeLongTo youth meetings alongside people who were identifying as trans, how did that make you feel? Do you have any specific examples of your experience?
Yeah, so the people who identified as trans were taken more seriously. They were listened to more. Gay people, lesbians, we were kind of not as important. Our voices weren't as heard. So we didn't have as much of a say on things. Like, for example, at one point there was furries showing up identifying as animals. And I took issue with that because I thought this was, getting ridiculous. Like, you can't identify as an animal. So when I took an issue with that, everyone was really annoyed at me. I had the room being like, let them do what they want to do. They can be what they want to be. But then eventually, after a few weeks, the trans people took an issue with them being there. And as soon as they took an issue with it, then it was taken seriously that they don't actually belong there.
Okay. And did anyone use any, I know we hear a lot about the pronouns she, her, him, he. Were there any other pronouns that were used in there that were a bit, I suppose, a bit crazy, like the furry?
Yeah, so most of us picked up pronouns at one point because it was kind of trendy to do. It was different from people who actually transitioned and went down the medical pathway. Having pronouns was kind of like being emo. It was just a kind of thing that we did. So we'd go by they, them mostly. But there was one time this adult man showed up and he said his pronouns were ze, them. And he was in his 20s. And I kind of said, that's ridiculous. Like, it's why are you making us use this ridiculous word, confusing us. And everyone was really annoyed at me then for questioning his use of pronouns.
Wow, okay. So if you were identifying as trans, it sounds like you had more of a voice, you were listened to and respected, but as a gay adolescent in the group, you might have raised the same thing, but your views were dismissed or you were shunned.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. We've seen different articles in the media over the last couple of years that up to 90% of people identifying as trans may be autistic. Does that statistic fit with the demographics that you might have seen in the BeLongTo youth meetings?
Absolutely. There was plenty of people in BeLongTo who they either had dealt with trauma in their life, young people, they could have been neglected, but there was definitely a lot of autistic people who I've seen over time them identifying as trans and even going on to the medical pathline, especially with the young women.
And were the people in there who were on the spectrum, did they ever express they did have trauma or underlying issues? And if so, did BeLongTo help address those issues, or was it an affirmative approach down the path of transgenderism?
It was constantly affirming, which is a huge issue you see in this whole industry. Anyone who's questioning their gender, they're just affirmed straight away, and they never look into any other causes, such as if it's a young woman who has an eating disorder, that's never questioned. It's never questioned if she's been sexually abused. It's just affirm, and many of these young women want to escape their trauma by transitioning, and it's never looked into whatsoever.
So you have on a Sunday morning a room full of 30 to 40 vulnerable adolescents between the ages of 14 and, was it 24, 26? What's the...
14 to 24.
14 to 24. So a room of vulnerable people between the ages of 14 and 24. And they're being affirmed that they're in the wrong body, despite the fact they may have trauma or abuse. The BeLongTo youth workers, were they nurses, doctors, volunteers? Did they have any medical experience to help people rather than just affirm?
Not at all. They were social workers, and there was usually one main youth worker and then someone training to be a social worker. who could have been in college doing their degree and they were just there for a bit of work experience.
Okay. And with adults being in the room, adults up to the age of 24, being in the room with someone as young as 14, were there any concerns that you had with adults being in the room with vulnerable minors?
Not really, because when you're at that age, you think it's normal and acceptable. It's only when you kind of reach that age where you're like, I wouldn't want to hang around with young people. So I feel like it was just normalised in that sense that, having older people there. And oftentimes outside the BeLongTo premises, these older people, they'd befriend us and buy us alcohol. And, if we were going to a house party, they'd come as well and buy all the drink.
Okay, so the people who met in the group, the adults, would meet the minors, the children, minors, outside and buy them alcohol and take them to parties.
Yeah, that was very common. Plenty of someone bought me a drink. I used to hang around mainly with the older people when I was there. And at one point they brought me to a nightclub, which now looking back, I'd never bring a young person to a nightclub like that.
No. And do you think they belong to youth workers who were facilitating these meetings on the Sunday? Were they aware that adults in the group were buying alcohol for the minors?
There was an incident that occurred around April 2017 and they were made aware of it, and then they stopped letting adults attend the Sunday group, but they still let them attend the other groups, which was Ladybirds and the Individuality group. But they told us in the Sunday group that this was due to lack of funding.
Did BeLongTo, when you joined the meetings, did they have any sort of code of conduct or any rules that you had to abide by? Did any kind of stand out to you?
Yeah, they had plenty of rules. There was 10 of them, and a lot of them were, keep your phones off or on silent, don't be bringing drugs or alcohol into the place. But there was one that always stood out to me, which was don't talk about gay club. So that was if you were to see another attendee on the street, you weren't allowed to talk to them. You weren't supposed to. You could get in trouble if you did. This was because they were like, you don't want to out someone, but it really kind of felt like they were trying to isolate us. So
when BeLongTo had that rule that you are not allowed to socialise with anyone in the group, that you may meet on the street or the gym or a club, how did that make you feel if you saw someone from your Sunday meeting on the street and you couldn't talk to them?
Well, most of us broke that rule. We'd get each other's contact details and we'd make plans outside of BeLongTo, but it kind of put this impression that if anything were to go wrong, we couldn't tell BeLongTo because we weren't meant to be doing that. So even if it was just meeting up in a park, or if we were drinking and if something went badly, if we told them, they'd kind of give out to us, kind of thing.
So it was like they were sort of only allowing you to have a social life and discussion and feel included in the four walls of BeLongTo.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. So we've seen in the media over the last couple of years that there's a real political push for trans activism in Ireland, in the schools, in the libraries. We saw recently that the ex-Minister for Children and Youth, Roderick O'Gorman, raided funds over €1 million from the likes of the Magdalene Laundries and the Roma and the Traveller community to move them over to fund his pet LGBTQ plus projects. Did you, in your time with BeLongTo, ever see any political involvement?
Yeah, there was a political involvement of People for Profit. One of the youth workers, she began running with People for Profit for the EU and the local councillor elections. And she came in, I can remember on 2 occasions where she was telling us about her involvement with People for Profit, and she kind of made it out to be that's the only party that would have our best interest as LGBT youth, as well as the working class people that were there. She said People for Profit were the only really caring party for people like this. And they're a Marxist party as well, which, that says it all really. They feed off people feeling oppressed and scared to kind of get a following. Mm-hmm. And I felt like that's what she was doing. I thought it was ridiculous. I saw right through it at the time. And I think that was one of my points where I was like, this isn't right, what's going on here.
Mm-hmm. Was there any political involvement asking the 30 to 40 people in your group to do any lobbying or any pushing for policy with the government?
Yeah, this was a common thing BeLongTo used to do. They used to come in and ask us to kind of write out statements, such as, when they wanted to lower the age for the Gender Recognition Act. They came in, they gave us all a piece of paper and said, write how this would be beneficial for you. And if they were invited to any public meetings, anything government related, they'd send a young person to give a speech. And oftentimes this speech was, you couldn't really question the narrative they had. If you did, it was the wrong point of view, whether it was about drugs or alcohol or LGBT stuff. you'd kind of have to follow what BeLongTo wanted you to follow in these statements.
So it was meant to be a support group for people who are in the gay or gay community or people suffering gender confusion, but there was some acts of getting the people in that group to be lobbyists for government policy. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of people went on into activism then for that side, trans rights activists, because we were basically being trained how to do that and how to lobby the government without directly knowing we were doing that.
Okay. And what have you, Sean, done yourself or your advocacy group, which is doing great work, Not All Gays? What have you done to inform the government of what's happened in the likes of BeLongTo and how it made you feel? Did you take any steps to notify the Irish state?
Yeah, we've taken a good few, mainly our president, Annick. She's done, for the last 2 years, she's done pretty much everything she can. She's met with the Ombudsman with a meeting along with a young detransitioner, and that didn't go anywhere. She's had 2 articles in mainstream media now, one with Mark Tighe and another with Joe Bartosh in the UK. She's written to so many politicians. She had a meeting with a few senators, a few members of our group met with them. And she even wrote to Micheál Martin when he was Taoiseach, and her email after a while got blocked and he didn't want to hear about it. And soon after that, Jack Chambers endorsed BeLongTo, and he's a member of the same party.
And what were some of the concerns that Aneg was raising to these politicians, including Micheál Martin, who blocked her email? What were a couple examples of things that were being escalated?
Mostly just how young people were getting indoctrinated, and there were young people who weren't in the right frame of mind. Like, I remember even when I went, I wasn't in the right frame of mind. I was doing a lot of underage drinking. I was in no place to be getting indoctrinated into this, woke madness. So a lot of it was, the impact it was making on young girls who were trying to escape being a girl through, because of if they were abused or they were autistic or had any other issues going on. She's trying to raise that and how common that was, and how the people we knew that were identifying as trans there, we kind of counted all of them. And after they stopped attending, 82% of them desisted from gender ideology.
Wow. So when they were attending BeLongTo, they were identifying as trans, but when they left BeLongTo for whatever reason, 82% of those who left just went on to live in the body they were born with without identifying as the opposite sex.
Yeah, and that includes both, just the sisters who never got medicalised and people who were medicalised and decided to detransition.
Wow. And regarding transition, were any of the practices discussed in the youth group? For example, I've looked at the BeLongTo stand-up week toolkit, where they go into schools for 1 week every autumn for a stand-up week at school. And I've looked at the toolkit, and it talks about things like chest binding, tucking of the genitalia, talks about top surgery, bottom surgery, hormones, puberty blockers, etc. Was anything discussed in the groups, be it from the youth worker or the people attending or a presentation, about some of these irreversible practices?
Absolutely. They would frequently talk about them. There was lots of young women who would have had top surgery, and they'd be given presentations on their experience, the pathways they took to get the surgery, as well as people discussing how to get hormones, what ways they went about it. A lot of them talking about the referrals, either in Ireland or in the UK. And these were all discussed as reversible things, such as puberty blockers. It was never discussed as something permanent. Even to mention the detransitioners, I remember asking one time, they were like, that's not real, that's a far right myth made up by TERF and non-existent, so I knew not to bring that up again. And it was just something I'd seen online. But all of this was kind of sold as this easy thing you can reverse if you change your mind.
Right. And did the BeLongTo youth worker, who was sort of leading or facilitating this space, did they ever say that the puberty blockers were reversible?
No, they never did. They never had any input on it. They'd kind of just talk through young people's experiences, because none of the BeLongTo youth workers were trans themselves. And I feel like if they were to go against what these young people were saying, the young people would go against them and try to get them their job removed. But you see, that doesn't excuse them now, because you see all the information being fed to the government through these youth workers is coming directly from young people who are learning this off the internet. They're not experts. They might be talking about their experience, but that's being fed up then, and it's being sold as fact, when all of the studies done on this have been completely debunked, and it's just been proven to just be causing harm to young people.
Yeah. So although they may not have said themselves that puberty blockers are reversible. They allowed that conversation to happen from the youth that were in the room.
Yeah.
Okay. And did BeLongTo youth workers, you mentioned they never let you discuss detransitioners. Did anyone who was going through a detransition ever attend the group, or anyone mention that they wanted to detransition?
No, not at all. When I say detransitioner, I mean someone who had been medicalised and went back. There was plenty of people who at times would change their pronouns back to being a girl or a boy, and so on, and it was just never really brought up. There were a few people that I remember that would be there frequently, especially one girl who was identifying as a boy, and she was on hormones, and then she just stopped coming, and then months later we saw that she was back to her girl name, and she never contacted anyone again. So there was cases like that.
Wow. And what was the pivotal moment in your life as a young gay adolescent where you decided that BeLongTo wasn't for you? Was there a certain breaking point where you walked away from those meetings?
Yeah, so over time I thought, at first I thought the pronouns thing was just sound like a fun little trend thing everyone was doing, but then I seen just kind of how serious that was getting and the impact it was making on young people and how fragile it was their mental health. And I think as I kind of was getting in a better place at life, I kind of could see it from a better light, because my mum always raised me to be a critical thinker and to question things. So with that, if I'd question things, I had a bit of a reputation of being controversial, of being edgy. So I was kind of just sick of getting treated like that. I was kind of like, well, do you know what, I don't relate to any of these people. I think what's happening here is a bit mad, especially with the politicians coming in. So I decided to stop going over that, and then eventually did my own research into this and seeing the lies that I was being sold.
And with legislation, there's a bill that's coming up, the prohibition of conversion therapy. It was tabled in 2018. And what this bill means, shall it pass, is that if someone who's gender confused goes to a professional, and that includes a teacher, guidance counselor, a therapist, psychologist, or what have you, they will have to be affirmed. So gender identity and gender expression are now added to the bill. As a gay man, how do you feel about that bill?
I think it's disgraceful because, as I was saying, the only thing that they're telling people to do is affirm these young people instead of looking into other areas of why they're so distressed with their bodies. So it's just going to cause more harm. It's putting them on a lifelong path of medicalization that is irreversible. It's going to cause fertility issues. You see the huge rise in osteoporosis. Puberty blockers have now been proved to affect brain development in a negative way. And instead of looking into some simple issues, that it could be a simple diagnosis, simple talk therapy could help a lot of them. They're just kind of medicalizing them and selling them off to big pharma.
So BeLongTo go into children's schools, into the classroom. They have an active role in schools here, the trans activists, and it's being facilitated by the Department of Education, the NCCA, who designed the curriculum. There's also people on the curriculum design board who believe that childhood innocence is a barrier. So as a gay man, how do you feel about BeLongTo, a trans activist group, going into schools to spend time with children?
I think it's very wrong. I think it's inappropriate on many levels, and I think it's actually, it could negatively impact plenty of vulnerable children who are, confused, feeling a bit lost. They could potentially get indoctrinated by this. It's also going to have a negative effect on young gay people because, most of the kids are sick of hearing about it. They don't want to know. They just kind of want to get on with things. And when you're telling a classroom to come in dressed as a rainbow, it's going to just, build a negative view on gays, then you're going to be sick of it. It's not like we have, a disabled flag, but they're bringing in a gay flag. And then BeLongTo argue this is about inclusivity when the Irish flag is inclusive to all people in that school. So I don't know why that's not good enough. But also, there's an irony about it with the parents and the activists that are pushing BeLongTo into schools. Most of them are against the Catholic Church having any say in the school because of the child abuse scandal that went on there. But transgenderism was built off child abuse scandals, such as John Money and the Raymer twins case, where he experimented on them, and it really developed a lot of what we see now as the ideology. There was sexologists who were involved with pro-pedophilia activism that developed the ideology, as well as BDSM activists, different kind of kink movements. I know Genevieve Gluck from Redux has written extensively about this, both on X and on her own blog. And she's done loads of research into it and really uncovered, if you really follow it back, you just see how dark the history of transgenderism is.
Yeah. And you mentioned about gay rights, because the trans activist movement, a lot of people feel that the T has hijacked the LGB, and that it's actually anti-gay and it's not doing anything for the gay rights movement. What are your thoughts on that?
I'd completely agree with that. I think everything the T stands for erodes what it means to be LGB. I'm a same-sex attracted man, but then the T is saying sex has no meaning. And I think this really severely impacts lesbians mainly, because you have, you know, men calling themselves lesbians, wearing dresses and trying to bully lesbians into sleeping with them, saying that, you know, it's corrective rape, basically. It's not really as bad with gay men, because the trans-identified females kind of tend to leave us alone. There's the odd one, but, you know, we're bigger than them, you know, they're not a threat to us.
Yeah.
But these men going into lesbian spaces completely, they've eroded lesbian spaces altogether. They're non-existent anymore. But they're kind of like making these sexual demands from lesbians. So it's completely like bullied us out of our own spaces.
And if you were to go back and have a conversation with your 16-year-old self, or any other, you know, teenager who's availing of BeLongTo at the moment, what advice would you give?
Well, now as an adult, I've realised, you know, I treat my sexuality the way I treat being left-handed. I don't think about it that much. It doesn't impact my life. It's not a big deal. I only use it to speak out against what's coming from the LGBT movement, in how it's harming children, traditional values, and so on. So I say to a young person, like, not to be worrying about it too much. There's no right or wrong way to live, you know. You'll be fine, but there's no need to go to groups that are focused on sexuality. It'd be the same as telling a straight kid, oh, this is a straight group for heterosexual kids to mix. It just wouldn't make sense, and I think it should be treated the same way with gay kids. Go to groups based on your interests, not your identity.
And that's a really good point. And I've looked at the accounts for BeLongTo, and they have over 1 million euros in reserves, and they get about 1 million a year allocated from public funding. So it seems like, looking at it from the outside in, that they are creating a problem, creating the perception that there's all of this bullying of trans-identifying kids, because if they perpetuate the problem and create the problem, they're the solution, it keeps the funding going. Would that be something, do you have any views on that?
Absolutely. It's seen all over the world in many different LGBT organisations. They would use different statistics to misconstrue them, such as, I remember there was a huge study done that everyone used to base an argument on, about black trans women having the highest murder rates over in the US. But this study was actually taken on female prostitutes, but they put the label trans on it, and even the people who took out that study and did that, they even said we lied, like they came out about that. As well, they kind of say that homophobia is a really big factor on why so many gay men commit suicide, but they don't talk about how the drug use within the gay community, how most people are in open relationships and how that has an impact on them. I even made a post the other day about a HIV podcast in Ireland where they were talking about taking meth in kind of like a fun way to like, oh, do you know what TENI is, was his quote, and then he's like, it's more addictive than Drag Race. Completely like joking about it as if it's just a game taking meth.
Wow.
So these are all issues that are looked away from, but it builds this narrative that homophobia is the issue. So then the funding comes in to kind of like stop homophobia, when in fact homophobia, that could have been true years ago. Homophobia has become a lot less common, and it's not as huge of an issue, but they don't kind of want to accept that because they lose money then.
We talked about what advice you would give to your 16-year-old self or any other adolescents going through gender confusion or, you know, coming out as gay. What advice would you give to a parent or a teacher who may have a gender confused child present to them?
I'd say if you have a gender confused child, try and understand where they're coming from, not from necessarily them wanting to escape their body, but look at the root cause, like what caused this. Try get them a counsellor that isn't going to affirm them and affirm these beliefs, because it's just going to, at the end of the day, cause more harm. Because what a lot of young trans-identified kids feel, they're like, oh, they imagine themselves as the opposite sex and it's going to fix all their problems. And then everyone applauds them when they first come out, and they think that applause is going to be endless. But really it's not. It will last a few months, and then it will be the next step. You see loads of detransitioners have come out and said that when they've gone for support, unless they kept going down and getting the next step, getting the next surgery, that support will go away. So And then after they've done that, they're kind of left by themselves if they have any medical issues. No one can help them. They don't know what to do because it's all experimental. So I'd really just look into different ways to help them find the root cause of it, see where it came from. They could have, been a victim of a sexual assault. They could be suffering from an eating disorder. They could be having other just discomforts with themselves, and cure that problem rather than feeding into an ideology. Same way you'd have with an anorexic child. You're not going to sit there and call them fat. So why would you tell a child that thinks of the opposite sex that yes, you are, you need to chop off your healthy body parts?
Thank you.
Thanks.
Now that we've heard what Sean had to say, it's time for every doctor, teacher, principal, mother, father, and public representative to take heed. If you don't consent to your children's education being hijacked by radical transgender ideology, visit NaturalWomensCouncil.ie under campaigns, where you can send a letter to your children's school and your public representative and the children's ombudsman. Thank you.